If you like audiobooks or audio shows, check out a free trial of Audible. Just click the link in the description.
Welcome to MINDSHOCK. This is Bruce McGuire.
Yeah.
And we are finally here launching our long-awaited NASA Moon Mission series. Were the Apollo mission hoaxed, real events, or a combination of both, where the footage was fake, but NASA really did put man on the moon? And we are not going to fall for any logical fallacies. This is a logical podcast examining all possible theoretical explanations with evidence for and against. As always, if you enjoyed the podcast, you can donate to our PayPal. Just check the link in the description. Make sure you subscribe to the channel, hit the bell for notifications. Make sure you allow your device to have those notifications come through. If you like this particular podcast, hit the like button, share it across social media platforms, of which you could find us on Twitter, Facebook, Reddit, Patreon. Patrons do get priority for topic, case, or co-podcaster requests or logical analyses. Questions, comments, theories, thoughts, suggestions, rebuttals, debunkings, insults of any kind, leave them in the comments section. All right, JR, so the Mind Shockers have been clamoring for this episode for quite some time, and I know I had to have you on because of your connections to NASA, and you have a lot to say about NASA, both regarding the moon missions and about the organization as a whole, particularly the way they operate tax-wise. And yeah, but before we get into all that, we've been doing podcasts for a bit now. You still won't disclose any real personal information, which is fine. I don't think the audience expects you to if it's going to expose you too much. So, bottom line, do you believe NASA put man on the moon? Why or why not?
Well, that's something that we're going to have to discuss in the actual episode, Bruce. We're not going to, we're going to take this, slow and steady, because, there are various aspects in which I think that they proved certain particular things, and I think that there are other aspects where, well, let's just put it this way, I think it was bunko. So, it would depend on, how, but, we're going to go into explicit detail. I will say one thing right off the bat. I find it interesting that only one country that's existed for only about 300 years was the only country on Earth to put a man on the moon. I find that fascinating.
Interesting point, of course. Some people even believe that a lot of the Soviet space missions were also hoaxed or faked.
Well, I mean, again, you have to understand that, a lot of this took place, obviously, John F. Kennedy was assassinated, there are people that are for him, against him, whether it's Democrat or Republican. Obviously, in this period of time, there's a lot of political unrest regarding both parties, and then there are other parties, independent parties, green parties, white parties, red parties, racist parties. So, I think that, but this was done during the Reagan administration where, I think the primary goal, at least in the eyes of the government, was to outspend each other because we were in competition with the USSR.
All the listeners out there that don't know, JR is a government agent of an unspecified capacity. I don't believe you've ever actually cited your clearance level.
Yeah, no, I said I won't, out of protection for myself, and the fact that there are people out there.
You also never disclosed the exact agency you worked for, although you have been all over the world.
Yes, I have. I will say that I have been part of the United States military service, and as a result, as many military people are, they end up going into government service afterwards. I will say that I did work for a particular branch of the military, and, as a result, I followed, I guess, what you would consider, the others, and entered into the federal system after my tours of duty. However, those tours are not necessarily classified, they're not necessarily declassified. Some of them were classified, some of them were declassified. What people don't understand is the stupidest shit on earth can be considered classified. It's not all just like, like Navy SEALs and that's classified. Like, it doesn't work that way. Like, some of the stupidest shit that you could imagine, like, taking photographs in a dumpster, filled with diapers, to get like that perfect shot of that face can be considered classified. So, yeah, that's, I've worked on both ends of the beacon, but out of protection of my family and out of protection of the people that I worked with, who I highly respect and regard, I'm not going to disclose any information on
Just
social media.
regarding NASA and the moon missions, your information that you're going to be going over with us, is this pooled from any kind of direct involvement in programs that gave you direct knowledge of at least certain aspects of the moon missions? Or is this information coming from you speaking with people who have been involved with NASA or any other projects in that capacity?
Oh, I've been I've been to Cape Canaveral. I've worked directly with individuals that, I've worked with not only just general NASA technicians, like I've also worked with the arm division and, other aspects of that, so like I've dealt with people that are directly involved and are still involved with, because you called it, how did you pronounce it? Apollo? Or it was, how did you pronounce it?
Apollo.
Okay, yeah. So, I mean, it depends on how you want to. Either the medieval Latin translation, the traditional Latin translation, the NASA American speak, or translating it into Greek. That denotes the pronunciation of the project itself. But that is one of many projects that we will cover because NASA has a lot of things in the works.
And here's something that I was always kind of curious about, because I've known a couple people who worked for NASA in the past as well, but they were all low level people that had nothing to do with anything. They didn't even discuss. I mean, what they have told me is that the moon missions or even space exploration wasn't even discussed in terms of their capacity. They were just low level computer people, and they just dealt with computer systems. They never, even the upper level people, they never really discussed any of the top projects. There was no, what I always find curious is, what is the sentiment around top level NASA officials? Is it, oh yeah, of course we went to the moon and we know because we have direct proof and knowledge that other people don't have? Or is it, how dare you question NASA? We've never seen any real proof, but how dare you question? Of course we went. Or is it even more sinister, like certain people in the flat Earth community report, where they kind of know it's all a sham and it's an inside joke? Did you pick up, what kind of sentiment did you pick up with in regards to higher level people within NASA?
Well, there's one thing you have to understand, and especially with the high level people, like there are things that NASA's done that are very good. I mean, like for example, like I said in previous podcasts, a lot of government research comes from the financing of graduate projects through university. There is one thing that's solid that we can guarantee that NASA did do. They generated and created the idea of rope raw memory. Rope raw memory is the very basis of the platform that we're now using to discuss their system. So there is technology that, it exists purely because NASA was an agency. In terms of the actual interior political structure, I will say that NASA seems to have a certain pull with the government, which is very interesting. We have organizations such as DARPA and, other things where there's, intellectual research that's, produced, but there's not a lot of organizations that can go to Congress and say, we need $5 billion and we can't guarantee it's going to work, and they just hand it over.
Yes, I know.
So,
I know you have a lot to say regarding that aspect of NASA. Here's a couple things that I will say, of course, without falling for logical fallacies. People give NASA all this credit as if the technologies they developed are more important than feeding every starving child on Earth, than creating good living conditions for every human on Earth, for solving homelessness. Because if you just suspend NASA's budget for just a week or two, a month, you would have all these problems taken care of. And people don't seem to care. The other aspect of it is I know people point to the black and white fallacy of, well, NASA created this beneficial technology, therefore that justifies not only justifies their existence, it justifies the tens of millions of dollars given to them every single day, which could have been spent on easing human suffering on Earth or completely eliminating it. If you look at the entire span of NASA's existence, if not a single cent went to NASA and it all went to the benefit of humanity, what kind of world would we be living in? And to those people, I say this, and to you, how is it 100% certain that if NASA didn't exist, that these technologies would have not been developed? They would have been developed anyway because the same human.
Well, but and again, this has to be put into the episode, because this is a very broad question. The very first thing that I have to say is that NASA didn't necessarily develop all those technologies. As I said before, a lot of these projects were privately funded graduate study projects where we paid Joe Blow $10,000 to spend his entire fucking college career developing one, microchip, and then we use that, throw it into a computer board, and all of a sudden that computer board cost $20 billion. Okay? The second thing is the same thing to be said for a cascade of government agencies. Okay? It's not just NASA when you talk about, saving humanity. If we really analyze the government budget, because there are many bean counters out there, but, when you look at an actual federal budget, they talk about trillions of dollars like it's just, $20, breaking at 20. So, and it's not just NASA. So with that regard, that would have to be something that we would have to push into the primary podcast.
Yes, of course. And I was just addressing the people that make the argument that not only should NASA exist, but it should get the money it gets because of these handful of inventions that I guess they're pretending would not have been developed, possibly developed by the same people, simply working elsewhere, working under separate government grants. So let's get into the intro here.
Whoa. Wait, let me just touch one thing here. It's not necessarily the innovation. It's also the assembly of that innovation into a finalized ideal that someone can follow. How long did the cell phone exist before it actually became a viable product for the American people? How long did copper exist or bronze exist before it was understood that it could be sharpened into a weapon? There are it's not just necessarily the innovation of technology, it's the assembly of it into a product that is viable for the course of humanity at that particular given juncture.
Well, but my point still stands. It's not like another organization or other people couldn't have done it. It might have been even the same exact people to do it. They might have even done it cheaper if it was.
Well, now there are organizations that are trying to do it. SpaceX has existed for what? How many fucking years? And
Well, SpaceX is also government subsidized, but we're not going to get into SpaceX. For the purpose of this, we're going to be discussing, for this series, we're discussing the Apollo missions. Did NASA fake them and everything that entails in typical MindShock fashion with a complete comprehensive analysis. So, of course, the main points that we will go into with dedicated podcasts, but I'm going to go over them briefly now, just so the listeners can kind of understand the purpose of the series. I have been kind of disappointed with a lot of documentaries out there. I'm sure you've seen that first Fox documentary that started all of this. Basically, it's credited with giving a widespread audience to this particular conspiracy theory that the Apollo missions were faked. And I don't remember the year. Was it 2001, 2000?
It was around that year.
And the documentary, actually, looking back on it now, they picked some weaker arguments. There are some very, very strong arguments that they never went to the moon. They didn't even address the strong argument, which I thought was kind of strange. We're obviously going to get into that. We're going to get into that, but the main points I think that are debunked are not the main points that those who do not believe the moon missions happened as purported. It's almost like a straw man exercise of debunking. If you haven't checked out the MindShock podcast, Debunking Debunkers, I lay out in pretty simple terms the problems with a lot of these debunkings. Because if the conspiracy being alleged is that this government organization known as NASA faked these moon missions, why would you use government sources to debunk the conspiracy theory? And that's something coincidence theorists really, I don't know why they're that silly. It's not that hard to understand. If you're trying a serial killer in court, you're not going to use the evidence the serial killer brings from home. You're not going to trust that evidence to exculpate him, right? I mean, how silly is that? Why do you think coincidence theorists do that, where they use the government's own information to debunk a conspiracy being alleged against the government? It doesn't make any sense at all.
Well, I think a lot of it also has to do with political influence. I mean, again, we look at for example, the assembly of the Apollo, system. We can touch on the Ball Corporation. The Ball Corporation, they're known for making mason jars. The idea of canning your own vegetables is, or jarring your own peaches is, but that company actually works with NASA to build these particular products. Those people have their people, and those people eat dinner with those people. So it becomes a gray area very quickly.
Well, I'm talking about the average American citizen, Joe Schmo, sitting in his apartment watching TV and drinking beer, who has no connections to any of these individuals. Does he? I mean, I don't want to insult Joe Schmo, but because there's Joe Schmoes that are conspiracy theorists, aka critical thinkers, and there are Joe Schmoes that are coincidence theorists that kind of don't understand all these logical fallacies that they're falling for. Because I've actually never heard anybody make an argument that NASA landed on the moon without using logical fallacies to support that argument. And that's the whole reason for the existence of this series and even of the MindShock podcast in general. There's definitely a dearth of media that keeps in mind logical fallacies to present logically. Now, I'm not saying that man didn't go to the moon. And it's actually quite interesting because Alex Jones, of all people, do you know what he believes about the moon landing?
No, I stopped watching Alex Jones after he tried to started selling snake oil. So you would have to I have to remove myself from that particular comment, because to be quite honest, I think that just like Dr. Phil, where he gives some sort of make peace advice, and then his wife comes on and sells her wares. Like, I think that there's something to be said about people that the Mind Shock podcast is different in that we touch on elements without marketing any particular secondary product or entity. So that's why I'm a part of it. If we did, I'd instantly just disappear forever.
I think we need to release a JR line of supplements. All right. Anyway, so Alex Jones said that he believes that man landed on the moon, but all the footage was faked. And of course, it wouldn't have been broadcast live, because would they really take the chance? Like, let's say the astronauts died and that was broadcast live. What kind of an embarrassment to America would that be? Because you have the Russians watching, you have the Chinese watching, you have the whole world watching. If there was an accident on the surface of the moon and they died, would they take that chance? And common sense says no way. Not in the middle of the Cold War. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's funny because we talk about like we all have seen the footage, or at least I would hope that most people listening to this podcast have seen, Neil Armstrong walking off the steps saying, it's kind of like a powder. But not only did we supposedly land on the moon, we landed on the moon before Neil Armstrong. We just never left the capsule. Okay, after Neil Armstrong, we had vehicles driving around the moon. Okay, but again, I go back to the fact that there is only one flag that supposedly sits on the moon, and there's been no other nation that ever, and they have trillions of dollars at their disposal as well. So yeah, I mean, like again, I don't want to touch into. I want to discuss Hubble. I want to discuss the International Space Station. I want to discuss Russia trying to buy the International Space Station from America. I want to discuss a whole bunch of different things, but those are separate episodes.
There's a lot to discuss, but I don't know if you specifically answered the question. Do you believe that NASA and America would take the chance of broadcasting a live accident on a moon mission?
I don't believe they would, but you have to understand that, there's also what I find the denigration of honesty that has existed over the past several decades, and that, people used to be a lot more honest than they are today. Like, if you go on somebody's Facebook and you look at that Facebook, it's like they have this perfect life. They don't know that, like, he's actually in a wife beater beating the shit out of his wife, on the side. You just see the pictures of, like, the whole happy family smiling, for the camera. The same can be said about this particular project. Like, there probably were accidents. There probably were mistakes. There's all kinds of things.
And I don't want to be remiss to not mention the dozens and dozens. I think the death count is over 80 of NASA scientists that have supposedly accidentally died in car crashes or other means. Suicides, car crashes, all of that. A lot of people point to the fact that people die, but how come all these other scientific organizations don't have anywhere near the amount of people dying in this time span? Some people find that mysterious. I'm not sure what to think of it. I don't want to fall for black and white fallacies. Obviously, a certain percentage people die in car accidents. Obviously, some of them might have actually died in a real car accident. But for the sheer amount of high-ranking NASA scientists that die in short amount in this small span of time compared to other organizations, because this is what people fail to do. They fail to have controls in place because most people are into scientism. A lot of people view NASA itself as a church, and the priests of this church can do no wrong, and you have to trust, you have to take on faith everything they say. That's a problem for truly scientifically minded individuals who are not going to take it on faith that man went to the moon using footage that looks very fake, that has wires in it, that doesn't seem proportional to the gravity, the difference in gravity. And they've done simulations. You can find CGI footage of what it would look like to walk and jump on the moon at 1/6 gravity, and it does not look like what the moon footage looks like. Not to mention, you have, I mean, we'll get into the specific details in each episode, but you have things that don't even match the known laws of physics in that footage regarding the landers and all of those things, which again we'll go into in specifics. But if that footage looks relatively fake and people are supposed to take it on blind faith, that's problematic for scientific minded individuals. Would you agree or disagree with that?
Well, we have to do a separate podcast, Bruce, on this, because what this is actually entering into is what is referred to as the pack mentality. And there's different types of mentalities. There's A-type, mentalities. There's pack-minded mentalities, where you're either a true believer or you're not a true believer. It could be a cult, or it could be, a church, or it could be like, let me ask you a question. The mafia. There are people that blindly follow and join into an organized, what the government would refer to as a RICO-based organization. They do it blindly. They might have they might have starving babies. They might need money. They might need this. They might need that. But you've seen, and I'm sure that a lot of your podcast people have seen, movies where, there's that like crying guy in the interrogation room where he says you can't say no to these people. Now let me ask you a question. To an organization that can print its own money, has its own military, and has the ability to basically vaporize, based on nuclear war, what it wants at will. How do you say no to those people?
I don't know, but if you do say no, do you end up on the list of scientists that have mysteriously died?
Possibly. We'll have to discuss that in later podcasts.
Okay, the other point, which actually you actually went into it a little bit, the coincidence theorists who illogically claim that if the moon mission was faked, that Russia or other space agencies would have automatically blew the whistle. You actually already started going into my rebuttal to that. Again, doesn't mean they went or didn't go. They might have went, of course, but we're discussing the evidence and we're not going to do it on faith. We're going to do it using actual science and logic. So, if something threatens an institution, why would anybody blow the whistle on it? So, for example, like mafias. Now, mafias can be competing mafias, of course. So, if mafias are in a neighborhood, you got the Russian mafia, the American mafia, the Italian mafia, the triads, whatever. Obviously, they're competing with each other. They will do what's in their best interest. But if blowing the whistle on another mafia threatens their own existence and their own their own schemes, scams, and diabolical plots to exercise control and line their own pockets, of course they wouldn't do it. So I don't know why this is so difficult for people to understand. It's really simple, and this is one of the points that gets brought up as if it invalidates the moon landing being a hoax, which obviously it doesn't. If anything, it strengthens the argument, but it's actually part of the argument of the conspiracy. If the conspiracy is that big, and the flat earthers, obviously we have to spend a certain amount of time talking about the flat earthers because this is intertwined into their, I guess, belief system as well, where they believe all space agencies have the purpose of hoodwinking the masses into thinking that we're on a heliocentric globe and all of these space and planets, all these planets are actual terra firma that you can land on, as opposed to gases or other types of energy that aren't three-dimensional to the point you could actually land on it. Some people actually think the moon is not a three-dimensional physical object. It's some kind of energy. So it's actually impossible to land on it. What do you say about that?
Well, what you asked was multiple part. In terms of the actual composition of the moon, we're gonna have to touch on that on episode one. But in terms of it's interesting. You spoke about, wouldn't they blow the whistle? Well, I find it very interesting that when we talk about the International Space Station, we have not only Americans but Russians in the same space station, in the same space capsule. So obviously an arrangement was met. It was, so this is the type of thing where we start seeing one guy backed up next to another guy with money in a hand, holding out behind his back to grab from another hand. So this is something that has to be examined very closely, probably in its own dedicated episode.
Yeah, and we will do that. I just wanted to touch on that because that's one of the silliest arguments that coincidence theorists make regarding moon landing not being a hoax and using that as evidence. It's the same thing with let's say the Catholic Church. You could have a church in multiple countries And even if the church is doing something bad, they're not necessarily going to blow the whistle on each other if it threatens the organization as a whole. And the other thing coincidence theorists use is the appeal to incredulity logical fallacy, where they don't believe there would be a reason good enough to fake it. Therefore, they're just going to religiously and dogmatically buy into the scientism because their feeble and ignorant mind doesn't know the reason. Well, again, that actually proves the point of the conspiracy theorists, aka critical thinkers, because the reason would obviously have to be a good reason and it would have to be classified so they wouldn't know about it. So the fact that they don't know about it could be used as evidence that if the conspiracy is true, obviously there would have to be a reason good enough to facilitate it. Is this all just basic common sense to you, or is it strange that we actually have to go through these aspects? Because a lot of the coincidence theorists, these are their arguments against a moon landing hoax, which are of course fallacious.
Well, it's not, it's not cut and dry because, I mean, you have to look at it from this perspective. And then, like, we'll use a perspective that existed before modern day technology. Okay, let's look at the Roman Catholic Church. The Roman Catholic Church was extremely powerful. And at some point, England decided, hey, you know what? We're not going to listen to the Catholic Church anymore. We're going to create our own church. Well, it's interesting how they didn't vaporize each other. They coexisted. So we're not dealing with something that's just purely based on logic, math, science, and reason. There's also the aspect of the human mind, which is emotion. And that's something that has to be thrown into the mix. And for several different reasons, it's very difficult because human emotion varies from individual to individual. There are sociopaths. There are people that are, like they've devoted their lives to saving others. There's a whole scope. So what you're talking about is a calliope of gray areas that have to be put into perspective, piece by piece, unit by unit, which is why it's a series and it's not just an episode.
Yep. And the other thing that really jumps out to me that the coincidence theorists have no answer for is the tens of thousands of telemetry reels that were just lost. Now, if someone claims to have executed the greatest feat and the greatest accomplishment in the history of mankind, and you ask for proof and they say my dog ate my homework, what is the response of any logical individual going to be?
You would have to ask Jesus Christ, because I believe that out of all the people on earth, he probably did just what you just said. And there have been wars that have been fought and lost and won.
Yeah, but that's
and there have been kingdoms that have been built and destroyed based on just what you said.
We weren't around back then, and that's a completely different time period. So to the people that witnessed, are you referring to him rising from the dead? Or are you which aspect?
I'm referring to just the basic logic of the fact that not only was he able to supposedly perform miracles, but not only was he executed, but it's been proven that he was a real human being. I'm saying that as a real human being, whether or not you believe in his doctrine or whatever, if you're an atheist or you're agnostic.
That happened so long ago, and we have so much broken telephone translations of all of those. Like that's I don't believe that's a congruent argument, because the people that were there, if they witnessed him doing what is purported, then they have that direct proof. They didn't need to rely on other proof.
And well, they some people would argue that they do. They call it the Holy Bible.
Right. No, I'm talking about the people at the time. Like if Jesus performed the miracle on you and you were healed, you don't need proof. That is your proof. So you have your direct proof. So, and because it happened so long ago, like I'm talking about in modern times. Like if you say you went to Pluto yesterday and I ask you, where's your evidence? And you say, my dog ate my homework. What is my response going to be? That because in a modern era where the telemetry reels did exist and were recorded supposedly, And what did they record? They basically just didn't back them up. I mean, I don't know if I even believe that story. Now, obviously, that doesn't mean they didn't go to the moon. Do you think NASA really does have the telemetry reels and they just don't want anybody looking at it for a particular reason? So they said that they don't have them?
I believe certain things about NASA. I believe that they have the video footage of when Columbia actually exploded, and they don't show it, probably to protect the family and the people that were actually a part of that mission. I believe that they have a lot of things that they're never going to disclose, because I think that they have their own reasons. Because again, we're not dealing with an entity, we are dealing with human beings. And those human beings have, again, we enter into the question of the gray area of emotions. There are things in this world, for example, the assassination of JFK. There is evidence that is classified, that, justifies certain things. Will it ever reach the surface? No, because you, as in a person, as a human being, not only do you have to have access to that information, but you have to have the knockers to push the button so the rest of the world knows that that information exists.
You didn't directly answer the question, JR. So you're saying they might have, it's a possibility they have the telemetry data. They just lied and said they didn't because they don't want other people looking at it for whatever reason, a reason we don't know.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so that's a possibility as well. But I think, and we're going to round out this intro because this was just laying the groundwork and saying everything we're going to go over. We're definitely going to go over the pressurized suit issues, the measurement issues, all of the inconsistencies, whether the Van Allen belt really exists or not, if the radiation would preclude any transfer of film. And of course,
that whole thing during the Mercury project.
Yeah, and the whole what nobody really wants to talk about, which is one of the smoking guns in my opinion, is that there was a documentary roughly 2 weeks before the first mission where the head engineer, who I believe was killed, uh, he said that there were no known metals or materials that could withstand the heat or the cosmic radiation. They didn't exist. And if you look at the material list of everything used in the Apollo missions, and you look at the melting points and all of these things, they don't add up and it's not even close. So how did they go? Well, the counterpoint, of course, is that NASA could theoretically have top secret materials that are not public, so they could never disclose what they used in order. So there's a lot of, I don't want to fall for black and white fallacies, of course.
Well, no, I mean, but again, like the same thing could be said. I mean, like, let's just pull out a corporation. There's a corporation known as Firestone. Okay, they make tires. According to records that are, classified, they have a tire, a material to build rubber for tires that will never wear. And when they came up with that formula, it was shelved because obviously if they created tires that would never wear, then they would never sell another tire.
Yeah.
So there are, yes, we will go heavily into this, but I think we should wrap up this introduction.
Yeah, I was just going over the quick overview. There's problems there. There's problems with could the film have even survived the trip. There's a multitude of issues that we will be going into. I just wanted to lay the groundwork there. But yeah, I think the crux of the issue for most people when discussing this topic is, of course, logical incomprehension. Because you can't use logical fallacies to support a position and call it logical. That's the opposite of logical if you're relying on information or arguments that are logically fallacious. Now, that doesn't mean your conclusion is false. If man went to the moon, they went to the moon. If they didn't go, they didn't go. But MindShock is all about logical examinations. And the burden of proof is on the one making the claim. This is something the coincidence theorists that cling desperately to their scientism dogma that NASA would never lie, or governments would never lie, or corrupt people are not corrupt. They cling to this dogma not realizing the burden of proof is on them or on whoever is claiming man went to the moon. Man went to the moon. That's an extraordinary claim. And extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, do they not, JR?
Yes, they do.
And we will be examining whether the evidence is there or not, or whether this is just a series of my dog ate my homework excuses. And just the last point I wanted to make regarding Moore's Law and the exponential development of technology, do you find it strange that if man really went to the moon, they kept planning to go again? Because if you go through the news, you can go through news clippings. The original return to the moon, if it wasn't the late 80s, it was definitely the 90s. It was early, then mid, then late 90s. Because when I was a kid in school, I do remember the announcements that NASA's going to the moon again every couple years. Every couple years. And then that continued even through the 2000s. And you can go through Google Archive and you can find all of these news releases that they were going back in 2000, then 2005, then 2010, then 2015, then 2018, then 20.
Oh, well, by 2015, we were going to Mars. So.
Allegedly. And that's a topic for a different podcast. But just in general, the news reports of the supposed return to the moon that were planned and never happened. Because during the original Apollo missions, what was the claim? That this technology had less memory than a washing machine? And now today, with all of this exponential increase in technology, they can't go back to the moon?
I'd go to the moon in a nanosecond. The problem is we don't have the technology to do that anymore.
It's kind of bizarre. It's just kind of bizarre. And then furthermore, they can't point any super high powered telescope to the surface of the moon to verify that the landers are there or whatever. It's all very bizarre to people.
Well, they do claim that there's a laser that if you point it at a particular bracket, it'll actually bounce back. But yeah, no.
And now that you brought that up, I will give the counterclaim to that. What is that laser bouncing off of? And we're going to have to dedicate a whole episode to that because that's a really interesting topic. And I saw this long presentation by an astrophysicist on how that laser works. And let me just tease this. It does not align with the scientific method, and that's all I'm going to say about that. And we will obviously go into that probably for its own dedicated episode. But just regarding the technological aspect, what happened to the tourism that was supposed to happen to the moon? Not just, by private companies like SpaceX was supposed to have rolled this out in 2008 or something originally, or 2011? When the space tourism was supposed to start to the moon, and that never happened. I mean, why do the coincidence theorists always ignore all of these stories that never happened if the technology is that legitimate?
Again, we'll discuss this, in length.
All right, there you go. That is what JR is willing to say for the moment. So join us next time where we will be doing point-by-point examinations of every aspect of the Apollo missions, and we are going to be talking about things that have not been talked about. Some really, really damning information, some damning evidence against the Apollo missions that have not been discussed on your typical conspiracy documentaries and podcasts. In typical MindShock fashion, comprehensive and not logically fallacious. We hope you guys enjoyed another edition of the MindShock podcast. If you like the podcast, you can donate to our PayPal. Just check the link in the description. Make sure you subscribe to the channel, hit the bell for notifications. If you like this podcast, hit the like button, share it across social media platforms. Questions, comments, thoughts, theories, suggestions, rebuttals, debunkings, leave them in the comments section. You can check us out on Twitter, Facebook, Reddit, Patreon. Patrons do get priority for case or topic requests. If you have any specific questions as a patron, you will get them answered as top priority. This is Bruce McGuire signing off.
And JR tapping out.
We'll catch you guys next time.